Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. This webinar is brought to you in conjunction with Dairy Sustainability Ireland and Food Drink Ireland SkillNet. This morning, I'm delighted to be joined by James Rambaud, and I suppose one of the key questions we have going forward relates to carbon sequestration, and carbon sequestration will be one of the key tools we have to fight against climate change. But one of the problems we have is our level of knowledge about carbon sequestration, what causes it, what factors influence it, is limited. At the moment, Teagasc have put in place an infrastructure to measure carbon. And James, you're involved in, I suppose, the rollout and the gathering of the data, the processing of the data in relation to that carbon observatory.
That's correct, Pat. Yeah, that's correct.
Would you give us just, I suppose, a quick idea of what is that infrastructure and where is it placed around the country?
Yeah, so we have an infrastructure of 28 eco-variance towers or flux towers, depending on what denomination you're from. They're scattered throughout the country, so north, south, east, west, over a range of different soil types, climatic regions, farming systems, and management types. So basically, what we're trying to do is gather real-time data, accurate quality data that we can then model up to represent the actual emissions coming from our carbon emissions or carbon sequestration rates for the whole country. Because at the minute in the national inventory, we're only using assumed figures. We don't have actual figures.
And I suppose some of those assumed figures, I think we have data coming through that some of them are probably a little bit too high on some of the landscapes that we're talking about.
Exactly. Some are too high, some are too low. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I suppose without further ado, I suppose we're getting into the meat, I suppose, of your presentation. So we might let you share your presentation with us.
Perfect.
So the floor is yours, James.
Perfect. Okay. So look, as Pat said, I'm James Rambaud. I'm a technologist based in Johnstown Castle, and I suppose I'm responsible for the rollout of the NASCO infrastructure throughout the country. We started back in 2020. Things were very slow initially with obviously COVID, but we've been slowly ramping up now, and we're looking to finish sometime near the end of the year. We should have our full 28 towers out and functioning and collecting data. So yeah, it was a very big project, but we're getting there. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to talk about the greenhouse gases. Okay, so we have CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane that we're all very aware of, and of course, water vapor is a greenhouse gas as well, but it's fairly self-regulating, so we don't really apply that to our I suppose the issues that we're facing around increases in the rest of the greenhouse gases. So we have, I suppose, firstly, carbon dioxide, which we're going to focus on, I suppose, in this presentation, and it's primarily an agriculture and burning fossil fuels issue, the increase in CO2. Okay, so machinery use, irrigation, for example, on peatlands, transport, of course, vehicles, and burning fossil fuels. So. And of course, deforestation. So not to mention that one, of course, but. So that's our primary, I suppose, source of emission is CO2, and everything that we talk about is related in terms of CO2. So you might see at the bottom there carbon equivalents. So both nitrous oxide and methane are expressed generally in terms of CO2. You might see there global warming potential of 265 and global warming potential of 28. So both of those have 265 and 28 times more global warming potential than CO2. Okay, so we move on to methane. Methane, the primary source of methane emissions at the minute is enteric fermentation, so which occurs in the digestive systems of cattle and sheep, ruminant animals. And then nitrous oxide, of course, that's nitrogen-based fertilizers. So when you apply it to crops, grasslands, fertilizers undergo chemical reactions and release nitrous oxide. So these are three big gases which are naturally abundant anyway, but they're just in too high a quantity at the minute and are causing global warming. Specifically to Ireland, then, I suppose the Irish agriculture sector accounts for 37% of Irish national GHG emissions. Now, if you look at the EU, that figure is around 9%, 8-9%. So in Ireland, it may seem like, wow, we're it's huge. Why are we so bad, comparatively speaking? But this is in part due to our small industrial base. So you look at the likes of France, Germany, the UK, for example, they have huge industry, which also emits a lot of GHGs. So I suppose proportionally, it looks like our agricultural sector is pumping out way more than it should be, but in actual fact, it's pretty much in line with the rest of Europe. However, just proportionally, it does account for a large chunk in Ireland. So again, look, I suppose the challenges that we're facing, the industry is expanding. It's ever expanding to meet global food demand. That's not going to change anytime soon, I would imagine. GHG emissions then have increased since 2011, and look, the trajectory is upwards unless we do something about it. We do have GHG targets in the agricultural sector, so we have to reduce by 25% by 2030. And then our land use emissions and carbon sequestration by 37 to 58% reduction in emissions by 2030. So we also have increasing political pressure, of course. The EU Green Deal, as we know, there's an increased emphasis on plant-based diets, and the likes of the Dutch farm protests, for example, for the suggested herd decrease there. And we must reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So moving on. The agenda, we'll just quickly talk about 4 sections. So eddy covariance, I suppose the fundamentals, the challenges that we faced and are facing in installing this infrastructure, how we are overcoming challenges or how we've overcome challenges, and then future direction. So where the technology, I suppose, will go, or where the research and the data will end up bringing us into the future. So in section 1, as I said, I'll just give a brief description of what eddy covariance is, and then speak a bit about NASCO and I suppose the benefits that we aim to bring to the country by using this infrastructure. Okay, so what is eddy covariance? So this is, I suppose, pretty much your carbon cycle. So eddy covariance measures net ecosystem exchange. Okay, so photosynthesis during the day, plants are photosynthesizing, so they're pulling in CO2 to undergo their natural processes. Okay, whilst that's happening, the ecosystem itself is also respiring. So as in the diagram, you have microbial decomposition, root respiration, stem and leaf respiration, etc. And then you have the soil itself, which is also the bacteria are respiring within the soil. So you have this in and out motion between, in terms of CO2, you have CO2 coming into the system and you have CO2 leaving system. So you have that every day. It doesn't ever stop, okay? So we need to be able to measure, in order to quantify, I suppose, our emission rates or our sequestration rates, we need to know how much CO2 came in and how much CO2 left. Now, when we talk in terms of carbon, there's not just CO2 we have to look at carbon as a whole. So if we're talking about an agricultural field, for example, a typical long-term grassland, you need to know your imports and exports. So if you've come in with slurry, for example, you've added carbon. If you go in and cut a silage harvest, you've removed a load of carbon because you've taken that grass away. So you need to account for that when you're doing up your figures. Okay, so I spoke briefly there where you have that in and out of CO2, okay? So that actually ends up forming these little eddies, right? And I've kind of tried to describe it in this image here, and there's a little tower there which represents the eddy covariance tower. So the air actually moves in pockets of eddies like this, and it moves across the landscape in an upwards direction, certainly during the day. And each of these eddies is carrying different greenhouse gases. Okay, the one we're particularly interested in at the minute is CO2. So as I suppose the eddy comes into contact with our analyzer, it will measure in a large eddy, for example, it will measure 2 CO2 molecules going in, and then when the eddy comes back around, it'll measure 1. So the difference there is 1. 1 more has left than has come in. Okay. Typically, the instrumentation, sorry, I shouldn't have moved on there. Typically, the instrumentation is a sonic anemometer. So that's just it looks like a claw, I suppose, and it's measuring 3-dimensional wind direction and speed. And that coupled with an analyzer gives us, I suppose, our CO2 concentration. Okay. Now that's measuring at 10 hertz, which is 10 times a second, and it measures all year round for the duration of however long you want it to measure. Typically, we'd like to gather 20, 25 years, 30 years data sets, because obviously every year is different, as we know. So when we have that data, because it's coming in at 10 times a second, it's very hard to try and analyze that data. So we average it out over 30 minutes. Okay, so we take a 30-minute data set and average it out. Now we can actually look at it and make sense of the data that's coming in. Okay. I suppose the advantages of using the eddy covariance technique is that we're getting real-time continuous measurements. So you can account for management changes and see the response to management changes instantaneously. Okay, so there's no lag, if you like, in if you go out and you plow up today, the result will be instantaneous in terms of CO2. We'll pick it up immediately. We also, I suppose, it allows us to capture the seasonal variations in CO2 levels, or after fertilizer applications, for example, we'll be able to capture plumes of CO2 that arise after an application of calcium ammonium nitrate, for example. So that's, I suppose, the basics of eddy covariance. I go into it more as I suppose as we go on in the presentation. But referring now to the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Network, or NASCO as we call it, the benefits and the reasons why it's being established. Okay, so it's, I suppose, as I made reference to earlier, the figures that are in the national inventory at the minute are assumed figures, but we want to improve and model and map that carbon uptake and release from agricultural soils, which we currently don't have. We need to be able to account for carbon sequestration rates based on climatic conditions, soil type, and management practices. So to give a brief example of that, if you have a permanent grassland, you go in and plow, all of a sudden in that instant, you're losing carbon out of your ground, okay? So you've opened up the ground, and now all of a sudden the bacteria has gone into hyperdrive and it's starting to break down the carbon that's in that soil, and it's being released as they respire as CO2. So we'll also get a better understanding of mitigation measures to increase carbon sequestration. So instead of ploughing, for example, instead of ploughing, you could maybe look at direct drilling, or instead of having just a ryegrass sward, you incorporate multi-species into your grazing platform. So that's another element of it. Then, of course, the national inventory, as I referred to earlier, national inventory and emission factor refinement. So we'll have actual figures that go into our national inventory. They will be reported back to the EU, of course, and they'll help, I suppose, bolster this potential carbon market that's coming down the line. And then having that data set will allow us also to participate in the EU ICOS. So the ICOS is the Integrated Carbon Observation System, system network. It's an EU-wide network where all of this eddy covariance data gets fed back in. Now, they have very, very strict criteria and data management policies and all of that, but it will allow us to submit data to there and, I suppose, help bolster the Europe-wide data set in terms of carbon emissions and carbon sequestration. Okay, So we'll very quickly go on to section 2. So the challenges we face and are facing during this setup. I've put in a picture of David and Goliath there because it certainly seemed at times like we were facing Goliath. But the 2 topics in particular I'll talk about are site selection and permissions and data management and storage. So I suppose the issues that we encountered fall into these categories. Okay, so ecological representation, permissions, access being access to the site, environmental impact, communications, and safety. Now, if there was a matrix established by Dr. Gary Larigan, where he selected the site based on a number of criteria, okay? That refined, obviously, all of the potential sites down to a manageable number. However, sometimes when you visit the site was not as it was on paper. So, for example, it was classified as a peat potentially on paper, but when you actually get to the site, it's really only an organomineral. So that site now immediately is, disclassed because it's not suitable for what it was originally intended. So again, when we encounter those situations, we revert back to the matrix, re-input some data from different sites, and the outcome gives us another potential site. The permissions, I suppose, were naturally enough for dealing with a range of different organizations, of private people. If you have, private farmers, you're coming onto their land and you're asking them, can we occupy a small area, albeit of their ground, but you have also the implications of that, okay? Now that farmer is going to have a technician on their site every 21 days, potentially in the height of grazing season, taking measurements and what. Some people just don't want that. So I suppose there was an element of meeting them face to face, explaining the process, giving them a time frame of this experiment, that it's a long-term time frame, and that I suppose the area that it's going to occupy. So it's essential to build trust and to maintain the open dialogue. If at any point in the process the farmer or the landowner wasn't happy with whatever process, it was quickly taken into account, discussed, and we adjusted based on that. So that was, I suppose, one area we encountered issues with permission was private landowners, but also we encountered issues on protected lands. So we happened to have a tower on an SAC, and in order to establish the tower on that, we needed ministerial consent. So we had to go to MPWS, which ended up leading us on to the Department of Housing, which ended up requiring a letter from the minister allowing us to install there. Now that also, required an environmental impact assessment, which I'll go on to a bit later. But so they're the kind of permissions we had issues with when we were, trying to get access to sites. So I suppose the third point then is very relevant: access. So if there wasn't adequate access to a site, then also it was discontinued or discounted, because if you're having to walk 10 kilometers into an area where to install a tower, that's unfeasible, albeit we do have one site where we did have to walk about a kilometer into a bog. But access was very important. If you couldn't get relatively easy access, it would just become too time consuming to visit the sites. So it was, again, discounted. Again, so I go on to the environmental impact here. So there was a few sites there where we had to do an environmental impact assessment to, I suppose, ensure that any ecologically sensitive species weren't going to be adversely impacted, I suppose, by our install and ongoing maintenance. So once they were completed, again, they were submitted, reviewed, and we were granted permission or not. A massive one, which might not seem obvious at the start, is communications. So all of our towers are remotely access capable. So each one has a modem, each one has a SIM card. Currently, that modem ports all of the data back to a server in Teagasc, and it also allows us to get into the tower remotely as well. So from Johnstown Castle, I can log into the furthest away tower and get an update on how the sensors are reading, if any filters are blocked, for example, or if any of the mirrors need cleaning, etc. So if any of the sites that we got to turned out not to have cellular connectivity, again, that was a site that was discounted. And then, of course, lastly, safety. So safety is paramount. So if the site wasn't safe for personnel, for staff to access, for us to install, maintain the tower, it was again removed from our search. So they were all big, I suppose, obstacles that we came across when we were initially setting up this infrastructure, all of which thankfully now we've actually, surpassed and worked our way around each and every one. And we're relatively happy now with the final product. So data management, this is another huge area because, as I said, we've 28 towers throughout the country. They're creating huge volumes of data. You're talking every month they're producing 8-10 gigabytes of data each. Okay, so and that's going to be a big data set when you're talking years down the line. So how are we going to store that data? How are we going to format that data? How are we going to secure that data? And how are we going to make it accessible to that large data set? How are we going to make it accessible to people? So stakeholders, interested parties, this is publicly funded infrastructure, so will have to be publicly available data at some point. So that, I suppose, that's a conversation that's ongoing at the minute. We are making, I suppose, huge headway on it. We've recently hired a data management technologist in Teagasc. So John Hyland, he's making huge inroads with how we're going to store this data, how we're going to protect it, but at the same time, how are we going to make it accessible to the public. We'll move on to section 3. So again, I spoke about the challenges, but how, I suppose, did we overcome some of those challenges? We overcame them by collaboration and partnerships, by standardizing protocols and training, and by, I suppose, forecasting, long-term planning and sustainability. So currently, this is only some of our collaborators and partners. You can see there's quite a lot, ranging from government departments to universities, to large national and international projects. It's huge. So, building these relationships is going to allow us to not only tap into the knowledge and skills and resources of these other organizations, which we might not necessarily have, but it'll enable us collectively to achieve goals that maybe would have been beyond us or beyond any single entity. So I suppose the level of collaboration between the organizations is going to hopefully continue to grow and expand, the network further, which will ultimately increase the impact and scale of the research being carried out. And of course, a big part of a research goal is impact. And hopefully, the infrastructure that we've set up now will create huge impact in terms of changing policy and advising policy into the future. So next, I'll talk about where we standardize protocols and training. So we're all aware of SOPs. Some of them are quite arduous to get through, but they have to be in position. They have to be there to allow us to, I suppose, train staff to carry out, work to a certain quality. Because of the data set that we're creating, we have to have each site consistent. We have to make sure that it's reproducible if anybody ever wanted to reproduce it. So, as I said, there's a number of benefits to to standardizing protocols and training. So it serves not only as a reference guide to new staff. Of course, there's not an area in the country at the minute that's not finding it difficult to hire staff or to retain staff even. So, if there's a high staff turnover, you need to be able to teach new staff quickly and effectively. So, that this is where we've kind of standardized the protocols to allow them to pick up a document and to be able to visit any of these sites, and for them to face the exact same site, if you like, regardless of wherever it is. So, again, if we're ever challenged on it, it'll ensure that our quality, the quality of our data is robust, and it also, I suppose, helps with efficiency. So if you're going from site to site, every site is the same. If you encounter a problem on one site and you encounter a similar problem on another site, it's pretty much going to be the same outcome or the same results to try and fix it. That's I suppose, the standardized protocols and training. Again, the training using the manufacturers, in-house training, I suppose, having checklists that, you hit every time you visit a site, you fill it in. There's a record of the maintenance then. So again, if you're ever challenged, you have a full, I suppose, documented maintenance record for each and every tower. Again, we go on to long-term planning and sustainability. So I suppose it was all well and good getting the funding for the initial infrastructure, having the small, I suppose, skeleton crew to set up the initial infrastructure. But again, this kind of infrastructure needs longevity for it to be worth its initial investment. So it has to survive 20, 25, 30 plus years. So in order to do that, we needed to develop a sustainable funding model. Now, Dr. Rachel Murphy has done great work on developing that model. She's really worked through the figures and how much, it's going to cost on a yearly basis to keep this infrastructure up and going. And I suppose to future-proof it as well. As one thing to just keep it ticking over, but you need to update it or it'll quickly fall into redundancy. So that sustainable funding model will allow us, I suppose, to be resilient to economic cycles. So if there's downturns in the economy, that pot of money, I suppose, is still there to ensure that we're still collecting that data and it doesn't slip over time. And then, it'll promote research, innovation, and collaboration. The longer this data set runs on, I suppose, the more valuable it becomes. I suppose, to use the words of a UK mathematician, Clive Humby, data is the new oil. So, if we're generating a data set with integrity, with quality, projects, stakeholders, government bodies, they will all, clamber around to try and get a piece of the pie, if you like. So it's important that we have that long-term plan to not only give Ireland as a whole good data into the future on a international level, but also internally for us, to bolster our own reputation, to bolster the reputation of our research. And again, all of that data over time will support policy decisions. Section 4, we go into where we can see these going. So there's technological advances, of course, that's a never-ending train. Technology moves on regardless. So even with the rollout of these towers now, there are technologies now that are trying to draw on the information that we're gathering to make it even more accessible and cheaper to be able to collect the carbon emission data, for example. Just to give some examples here, we have drones, for example, using NDVI. Terrain AI are doing great work on remote sensing at the minute. So I just included, I suppose, what they're looking at in terms of machine learning, in terms of collecting data on different scales. So the eddy covariance towers being the ground scale, looking at the field scale. The drone, then you're looking at, numbers of hectares. The plane, again, larger still, and then ultimately the satellites. And all of that is being fed in to a model where they're trying to develop machine learning, where they can, where the machine is able to accurately estimate the sequestration or emission levels from just, from satellite level as opposed to ground level. Again, having this infrastructure is going to allow us integration with other monitoring networks. So ICOS, which I've already made reference to, Terrain AI, of course, we'll be feeding data to them, which I've referenced already about the machine learning and the remote sensing. The agricultural catchments program, of course. So some of the towers which are within NASCO are actually agricultural catchments program funded. So there are 5 altogether at the minute, and they're scattered throughout the country on 5 different catchments. And then it'll allow us to participate in CAMS as well, which is the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service. So it's an EU atmosphere monitoring service, which will be, again, invaluable for cross-country collaboration. So that just brings it to the end, I suppose, of our discussion. If anybody has any further inquiries, our contact details are on the screen now, and they'll be made available later. So if anybody has any questions, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I will answer any questions.
Okay, and just to remind people to use the Q&A for questions. I suppose a couple of things. Sorry, you might stop sharing your presentation there.
Yeah.
A couple of things spring to mind. If I'm looking at the transport sector, to calculate my emissions, I take the level of emissions from a litre of diesel, and I know the number of diesel, and it's a relatively easy calculation. It strikes me that the data you get has a long way to go from being the concentration in eddies to actually giving us a figure on the level of sequestration or respiration that's coming from land. There's a huge complex piece of calculation there, is there?
Absolutely. So again, as you referenced, if you just look at the concentration, it gives you only part of the picture. Okay, it's what is leading to that concentration that is the important part. Okay, so the management decisions that have made, that have happened on farm, for example, the soil type, peats, for example, we know drained peats emit a hell of a lot more CO2 than, a free draining mineral soil. So, of course, then you're talking about the crop type that's on it, the climatic region. So the drivers that behind all of that is the climate. So there's a multitude of factors to take into account when you're dealing with all of this. And again, you're talking carbon imports and exports. Aside from the gaseous form, you need to know what carbon has left the system and what carbon has come into the system. And that's not only in terms of the biomass that's on the ground, but also carbon leaves through water. So you need to, look at dissolved organic carbon as well. There are multiple, I suppose, avenues and areas that you need to look at to be able to build a picture. I mean, if you're looking at the animals then as well, you need to have the methane figure in order to be able to give you a carbon balance. So it's a huge, large scale thing to try and work your head around.
I suspect you had a number of organizations coming to you to try and put in, looking for, and others where you were going in. So the balance in terms of finding sites, was that relatively easily got? I know sometimes it's difficult to get the right place, but I suppose a number of organizations did come to you with offers.
Absolutely, yeah. So they weren't always the right sites. Yeah. But certainly, yeah, on the mineral side, the sites were very easy to get. Yeah. On the peat side, it was much more difficult. The reason being, like a peat is so diverse, it's so difficult to classify that, almost 2 fields side by side, they might be what you would call peat, but they might be in 2 very different states of degradation or of drainage or of type of peat. So trying to get sites that were representative of a large area was very difficult to do. And actually, we still have 2 sites that we're trying to kind of really tease out and work through Hopefully we'll get it done and dusted by the end of the year, but it's proving to be very difficult in terms of the peat. Yeah.
And presumably the emissions and the management practices that are possible on a blanket peat compared to a raised peat are just chalk and cheese.
Absolutely, exactly.
Mark, questions flying in.
James, yeah, there's a lot of questions, James. A lot of compliments on your presentation. Well done, James. There's a number of questions here around soil carbon, and what role do soil carbon measurements play within the program?
So again, our measurements give us the actual CO2, exchange, if you like. But at the minute, the Signpost program are rolling out their actual soil sampling phase. So they're looking at soil carbon sitting in the first 10 centimeters and then down to a meter in the soil profile. Okay, so that'll give us, on our Signpost farms, that'll give us the carbon stock that's currently there, right? And that then we'll have a starting point. We'll have the tower monitoring events over a 5-year period. Then the Signpost will be back in, they'll sample again and get the new result. Okay, so whether that be up or down in terms of soil carbon, we will have the picture with the eddy covariance tower telling us the story of why it's up or down in those 5 years. So there's a lot of work going on currently looking at soil carbon.
Yeah, and they're being established as we speak, James, out on the Signpost farms, as you say. There's another question here as well, James. Is it possible to distinguish between agricultural-based emissions and a cement factory emissions located in many an agricultural area? So can you differentiate where the emissions are coming from?
Yeah, you can. It all depends, I suppose, on the placement of your tower in relation to that cement plant. So predominantly in this country, our winds come from the southwest. Okay, so if you were to place your tower northeast of the cement plant, you would find it quite difficult to disentangle what emission comes from the cement plant, what emission comes from the actual agricultural field, if you like. But if you were clever and put the cement plant to the southwest, or to your northeast, should I say, then there's nothing obstructing your predominant wind in terms of CO2 emission. So what you'll be capturing predominantly will be CO2 from the land, but when the wind blows then from the northeast, you will see discrepancies in that CO2. So you could then maybe partition out where, when the wind is coming from the southeast or from the northeast, I'm getting, strange readings in terms of CO2. So you can then maybe attribute that to the cement plant. But certainly if you were looking at a site to establish a tower, I would steer clear of a cement plant, because it would be
there's a number of very good. There's a number of questions here around the data that's been collected, and is there any results available, or can they be shared to date?
Yeah, look, I mean, the results, they're very, very preliminary results. They're showing that the national inventory figure of 0.5 ton is actually a bit underselling us on mineral soils. It's looking like it's more so around the ton mark, maybe 1.2. So it looks like we're doing slightly better, but again, we're very preliminary. We're talking data sets that aren't even a year old yet. And that can change from year to year. I mean, next year, if we end up getting a drought, any, fields that potentially are, typically carbon sinks could turn into a source, and that'll throw it off altogether. So you're looking at trying to develop an initial data set, which is not ideal. I mean, it's not what people want. People want answers now. You want an initial data set of the bare minimum of 3 years, 5 being the ideal. But that's, people need answers now, so we can only give them what we're seeing at the minute. But that story could very well change by this time next year.
Okay.
Just a question there about potential access by others to the data. And I think you mentioned in your presentation that it's a publicly funded project. To what extent will other researchers or international researchers even have access to the raw data if they want?
I suppose initially, I mean, we have priority because we're the ones that have rolled out this infrastructure. So we have priority initially. What that period of time is, I don't know. I know there are projects that are looking for data already, and they are submitting, of course, data sharing agreements, and those agreements are being put in place at the minute. But certainly after a period of time, whatever that period of time is, eludes me at the minute. But yes, that data will become publicly available, and it will be there for whoever wants it. I would imagine that period of time might be 5 years, might be 6 years. I just don't know.
There's a question there in relation to how advanced we are in relation to other countries, where there seems to be a lot more of a conversation around, I suppose, remunerating farmers for carbon sequestration. But in reality, have they a lot more information on which to base that on, or is it very much kind of a conversation depending on what comes out of science over a period?
Yeah, so I mean, there are countries who have, way more advanced data sets than we do. There are countries with 20, 25-year data sets there on carbon emissions and carbon sequestration. I suppose the disadvantage for other countries, they typically tend to be much larger than our country, okay? So the figures that they're attributing, while based in science, yes, might not be fully accurate because of the spatial variation between the sites that they have. Okay, so whereas a figure of carbon might be worth 50 euros a ton or whatever that may be, and the payments are all based on that, I think that the view certainly is here from an Irish context is we need to get cold hard figures for carbon, so that when the market starts here, that the market has integrity, and that the values are actually based in fact, as opposed to wildly modeled data.
Yeah, and
it's a very I suppose huge area. It depends whether you're looking at it from a public or a private perspective. I mean, the amount of companies at the minute, private industry at the minute, that are doing carbon sampling, and are they all following the same protocol? Are they all singing from the same hymn sheet? I don't know. So it requires serious thought, the carbon market that's emerging in this country.
There's a question there in relation to, he's just making the point that the talk seems to be all about carbon change, but what about the carbon that's contained in our soils? And I think it would be fair to say that there is a huge emphasis on maintaining the carbon, the high levels of carbon that are in our soils, but also around getting increases. And it's only the increases that can be that we can get credit for.
Absolutely. So I mean, we're well positioned in this country to have quite high carbon levels in our soil anyway. But it's certainly an absolute imperative that we keep that carbon that we have locked up and add to it. The potential for loss, as soon as you disturb soil, the potential for loss is huge. So the less you can disturb your soil, the more opportunity you have to hold on to the carbon that's there. And again, like I suppose what I should have mentioned is, in terms of carbon, the more carbon you have in your soil, to an extent, you're going to improve your soil structure. You're going to improve its water holding capacity, which, I mean, in the summer months that are coming down the line, is going to be vital for us to have, for our soils to be able to retain that water. And of course, when you have more carbon, you have more microbial activity, you have more mineralization, you have more minerals that are released, which has a knock-on effect on your fertilizer bill. So it's all relative. Before you even talk about a carbon market or getting payments for carbon, you should be getting carbon into your soil to benefit your own farm. It will impact your own farm to increase carbon levels, aside from any payments that may come down the line.
James, there's a few questions there around the whole area of soil carbon and CO2. Again, is there a conversion factor? Like you talk about the half ton or the ton of soil carbon.
Yeah.
How do we convert that to CO2 equivalents?
Oh, what's the figure now? Yes, so there is a figure, I suppose.
I think I can help you. Yeah.
Do you have the figure to hand?
I think the conversion is 3.67.
That's it, yeah, 3.67. So when you're talking about CO2 and you're converting that down to actual carbon, for every ton of carbon that you have, the equivalence is 3.67 tons of CO2.
So if we fix or if we sequester a ton of soil carbon, that's the same as 3.67 tons of CO2 equivalent.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly, yeah.
There's another question there around tillage. James, you talk about when we plow soils, we get this release and you can pick it up quite quickly. What's the time frame, or you know what I mean? Is it a matter of days, weeks, months, years,
So it's immediate.
Immediate.
Yeah. So as soon as the soil is broken, you will see an increase in CO2. And that's why it's vital. So a tillage system, if you like, is a system that's forever in loss, because you're always, you have to go in and disturb the soil by the nature of the beast that it is. But it's about minimizing those losses. So going in with cover crops, for example, as soon as possible after harvest, instead of a ploughing system, maybe looking at direct drilling. It's about, again, it's not always easy to say when you're looking someone with, money in their hand, but instead of selling your straw, maybe look at chopping the straw. Maybe not every year, but every 3-4 years, chop the straw, put it back in. It's all about trying to keep the carbon that's there from being lost. So if you're putting in cover crops, if you're chopping straw, if you're going in with direct drilling instead of ploughing, again, you're minimizing the disturbance. You're allowing that soil to recover, I suppose.
Yeah.
A question there. Do you have any flux towers in forest or in forest areas as well as agricultural? And is there a whole different calibration of the systems to take on board forest systems?
So it actually, we as Teagasc don't have one on a forest system at the minute. There are other, NUIM, Maynooth have one there. Trinity have a couple out on forests. It's actually, yes, they're slightly different setups. Obviously, the forest one is an awful lot taller because it has to be above the canopy, but it's actually an easier system to monitor than an agricultural field, because you can imagine the amount of activity in the forest, certainly anthropogenic related activity is quite minimal. Whereas, if you're looking at an intense dairy system, every 21 days, there's animals going into that field. So you have to be there to account for the grass that grew, the grass that was grazed, the grass, that was taken away. There's an awful lot more involved on a much shorter time scale looking at agricultural systems than there is on forest systems. But we will have one on an agroforestry system set up in Johnstown Castle by the end of the infrastructure. So that's looking at incorporating, I suppose, trees and grassland. It's not a full forest or a woodland, as you call it, but it's a grassland with significantly more trees than would be in a typical grassland.
Okay, and just out of curiosity, if you have, or do you have an ability by using wind direction to look at a number of different, I suppose, management factors at a single eticovariance tower?
Yes, but the issue there is you're reliant on wind direction. So if you had 4 paddocks, for example, a nice square paddocks, and you put your tower right in the center of those 4, your predominant wind is going to come from the southwest. So for any management effects that happen in the northeast, you're hoping that that management effect takes hold when the wind is blowing from the northeast, which is not going to be too often. So it wouldn't be ideal. You're kind of maybe two treatments split fairly evenly in a southwesterly direction. You could, but it's ideally you want just the one management type in your footprint.
Okay. There's another question there, James. Can soil sort of meet a saturation point around carbon, or will they continue to sequester carbon?
No. Annually? So they will reach a point where they can no longer take any carbon in. But that, we're talking, you'd want your soils fairly saturated to be able to reach that point. The likelihood of you reaching that point is slim. It is driven, however, by the clay content in your soil. So the likes of a sandy soil, for example, whereas it might sequester the same rate of carbon as a heavy clay soil, like Solihead, for example, like that's, they may take it in at the same rate, but Solihead has that ability to really hold on, to bind that carbon to the clay particles, whereas, a typical sandy soil might not hold on to it. It could be lost just as quick.
There's a question there about the impact of the plant types going from a grass, which has a fairly shallow root zones, to clovers, which might be a bit longer, to a multi-species sward. Is there a possibility that could have a significant impact by burying carbon deeper through those longer rooting plants?
Absolutely. So typically, the main bulk of your carbon sits in that top 10, 20 centimeters, 30 centimeter part of your soil profile. So if you can get plants that have the ability to shed their roots much deeper than that, then you have the ability to, pull carbon and sequester it deeper in the soil than your typical ryegrass sward would be. Yes, absolutely.
James, there's a question there. Could you please say a few words about the sensor measuring the CO2?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's an infrared sensor. So it's using, infrared is heat. We all know it when we're using the heat lamps on the lamps in the winter. So that's what it's based off. And as I suppose the CO2 enters the analyzer, it hits this beam of light that's going back and forth across two mirrors. Okay, so the concentration coming in is taken by the difference in temperature between the inlet and outlet as it flows through the analyzer. That's how it measures it. And as I said, it measures it 10 times a second. So it's a continuous flow, if you like. There's no break in the data. It's able to pick up really minute changes.
Okay, and there's a question there around the height. Do you adjust the height of the mast, James, or is it fixed?
No, you can adjust the height of the mast. So typically on a grassland, the mast stays at a given height. So whatever, if you're in a 4-hectare field, for example, you might set your sensors to be 2.5 to 3 meters high, somewhere in around there, because you're going to capture the 4 hectares typically with that kind of height. On a cropland is where you're going to have to start raising or lowering sensors. Okay, so if you had a field of maize, for example, when that maize goes in first, you're going to set your instruments a minimum height of 1.6 meters above the top of the canopy. But obviously, as that maize grows, it would quickly get covered if you weren't to move your sensors. So in the likes of that, yes, you have to move your sensors with the growth of the crop. Absolutely. And that applies for forest systems as well. If you're putting out a tower on a very juvenile forest, as that forest grows, your tower is going to have to grow as well.
Somebody commented that you didn't show the EPA as a collaborator in your list of collaborators. Wondering.
I did stipulate it was only some.
Very good. So they are there. But I suppose that one of the key questions in relation to the involvement of the EPA is the acceptance of I suppose some of the outcomes into the inventories over the next while, and that's presumably going to be one of the key parts where involvement with the EPA will
absolutely definitely the EPA are the reporting body, so our data is going to have to be of decent enough quality to be able to hand over to the EPA for them to report on it. So yeah, absolutely.
A question there: is there an average cost of the estimated single tower, or do you want to say how much value you're putting out there?
A CO2 tower now typically costs in the region of €80,000.
And if you add the other gases to it?
For every analyzer, so if you add a methane analyzer, the analyzer itself is worth 70,000, just the analyzer. And then if you're going into N2O, you're talking much lower concentrations of gas. Okay, so you're talking going from parts per million to parts per billion when you're looking at nitrous oxide. And again, to get an instrument to be able to record the very minute changes that could happen and happen instantaneously, depending on a rain event after a fertilizer application, for example, that instrument you're looking at 125,000, anywhere to 150,000 for just that instrument. So, if you have all three on a tower, you're very quickly over the $250,000.
Okay, so yeah, it's a significant investment and a lot of people involved in bringing this, I suppose, from raw data into research.
Absolutely, yeah. Currently, because we're still in the establishment phase, I suppose it's all fallen on poor Rachel. So Dr. Rachel Murphy's head to try and look at all of this data at the minute and make heads or tails of it. It's certainly no mean feat that she has ahead of her, for sure.
Well, hopefully she's a better computer than the rest of us engineers. Okay, listen, I think we've answered a lot of the questions that have been posed. Absolutely fascinating. As the data starts to I suppose yield results and give us better ideas, I think it's going to be a constant process over the next number of years. Yeah. So we'll bring you back and potentially bring Rachel back to have a look at that data and what it's telling us about sequestration. I'd just like to thank you, James, for coming on. Mark, thank you very much for the questions. And we'll see you again, hopefully next week. Stay safe until we do. With that, goodbye. Thanks very much.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.